Bonjour, React Europe. So sad we could not all be together this week in Paris, but safety first. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of state injection in React, and specifically how that relates to where we are in 2020 with render props. So what's the first thing we learn when we start programming? Well, normally it's to print hello world to the console or to make hello world appear in a browser window. But what's the second thing? Second thing is to declare a variable. Now, I started out in BASIC, so I think this would have been like a dim statement, but this is what it looks like in JavaScript. Now, once we have written this line of code, we now have a value that we can use our program to manipulate. So already on day one of programming, we're doing what can generally be called state management. Likewise, the first or second thing we learn when we're learning React is how to have our component maintain some state value. Traditionally, this was done with this.setState, but nowadays with hooks, it's more common to use react.useState to maintain some state. Now, as we write our React applications, we can notice certain patterns. And once you notice that 3 or 4 of your components are all doing state management the same way or maintaining the same kind of state, you realize that it could be way more efficient. You could be more efficient as a programmer writing future components in the future if you begin abstracting state management. Now, over the years since React was released, there have been several attempts at this. Remember, the question we're trying to find the answer to is, how can I write some code to manage state and then reuse that code in multiple components? Now, according to the ancients, and if we had been physically in a conference together, I'm sure you could probably find 1 or 2 walking around. The legends are true, I swear. There was once a technology for React state management known as Mixins. Now, I myself even wrote a few dozen Mixins back in the day, but I can hardly remember how or why. I did some archaeology and was able to dig up this ancient scroll warning of the evils of this witchcraft. Now, luckily, to save us from this time of darkness, an army of Lambda-loving functional programming nerds swooped in and introduced us to a new way to share state management functionality between components. They called it HOCs, which is an acronym for higher order components. And these FP nerds realized that you could write a function that took a component and then returned a new component that had some superpowers bestowed upon it. And for those of you that don't know what HOCs look like, they look something like this. So we have a function that takes a component and returns another component, which does something. This is the pattern of all HOCs. In this example, we are maintaining a counter state, and we have methods for mutating that state, increment and decrement. And what we do is we render the component we were given with any props that we were given so that we pass our props down. But here's the important part. We're also giving it our count value and our increment and decrement mutators. So voila, now we can add this counter functionality to any future component. And there's nothing we programmers love than solving a problem in a generic way and knowing that we will always have that tool in our toolbox for future needs. So how do we use this HOC? Well, like this. We have a component that we want to enable counter functionality on, something like this. And we write it assuming that it's going to have a count prop and increment and decrement props. And then, watch this sleight of hand so you don't miss it, we decorate our component with count HOC. And this returns a new component that will have our state and mutators injected into it. And this is where the real magical powers are bestowed upon our component. This is optional, but when I was writing HOCs, I like to overwrite the same variable, so it was easier if you were adding multiple of them at a time. And then we export our component, which now has these superpowers that we didn't have to write when we wrote this component. That's the important part. We were just able to plop in this functionality from our toolbox. Pretty powerful stuff, HOCs. And they enabled the rise of some of the most popular state management solutions in React. Now, I want to emphasize a term here. The HOC we wrote is injecting state into another component, okay? We're taking a component that doesn't have state, and we're injecting state into it. Now, over the years, as with every new technology, we noticed some drawbacks to the HOC pattern. For one, you have to decorate the entire component to inject state into your props. And also, you can't just inject a bit of state right where you need it when you're writing your JSX. It has to be for the whole component. So the community felt some of these pains and came up with a solution: render props. And this pattern follows the inversion of control paradigm, where a component can worry only about managing state and not about what to render. And it will just call whatever function it's given to render. It's given the function as a prop, hence the term render props. So let's look briefly at what this pattern looks like. If we start with our previous HOC example, let's change this to be a render prop. So first we remove the function, leaving just the class. And then rather than rendering a component, we call this.props.children to let our parent component decide what we render. It could be this.props.render, but I personally like putting the render prop as children, which we will see in the future. And this is this inversion of control. We're giving our parent both the power and the responsibility of what to render. And we pass it not a component, but an object. We don't need to pass it our props necessarily, because our component, our parent already has all that state. But we can just pass along our count state and the mutator functions. So it's really pretty similar to what our HOC did. But the real power of render props comes when we look at how we use them in another component. So let's look at that. This is how we were consuming our state provided by our HOC. It looks something like this. So to inject our state via render props, we need to add our components inside the JSX, like so. Now, this is this function as children syntax that will look really, really bizarre to you if you've never seen it. The first time I saw it, I was like, what? You can't put a function there. But this pattern takes advantage of one of React's secret superpowers. Don't tell React's competitors. Namely, that React is just JavaScript. You know, JSX is just syntactic sugar upon functional calls. And there's no hard and fast rule saying that you must pass, JSX elements as children. You can pass functions. You can pass numbers, dates, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's all just JavaScript. So, where was I? So rather than get our count and increment and decrement from this.props, they're going to be passed into our function up here. And the final step is just to remove our HOC decoration, and we're done. Now we have a component that will have count state management. We have a component that will give us this count state management wherever we need it. And one thing that I really want to make totally clear is that render props killed HOCs, okay? How do we know? Well, if you like taking dogma from thought leaders, we have this. And there are very few tweets that I have seen over the many years where I distinctly remember that tweet changing my worldview. And this is one of them. Like, I didn't really get the power of render props until I read this and I thought through it. And Michael is absolutely right. And I'll show you, we can rewrite our HOC using a render prop component. It's really quite simple. Looks like this. So here's our HOC. And let's change it to use our render prop component. First, we need to rename the class, because that's the name of our render prop component. And then we can clear out all of our state management, get rid of all that white space. It's looking cleaner already. And then we wrap our component in the render prop component. And we pass along the injected state that we get to the component that we've been given. And we're done. Michael was right. There's really nothing that can be done with a HOC that can't be done with a render prop pattern. The only possible exception to that is that if you really need your injected state in your lifecycle methods, then you can convert a render prop into a HOC just like we've just done. But really, that's pretty rare in my experience. So for all intents and purposes, HOCs are dead. They are no more. They've ceased to be. They've expired and gone to meet their maker. HOCs are an X pattern. Now, once you know render props, you almost never need to write another HOC. Now, one thing I want to point out here, and this is important, so pay attention. If you're taking notes, write this down, is that render props are providing state injection inside our JSX. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, sometimes you have to do some calculations and preparation in your render function before you return JSX, right? So a render function can be thought of as consisting of two parts, okay? There's the preparation part, and there's the JSX. If it helps, you can think of drawing a line through the return keyword, okay? That way you can clearly see, you can tell which side you're on. Now, render props were all the rage back in 2017 with the elegance that you could just plop some state into your JSX and not necessarily need to modify your component that much. And it was just the greatest thing ever. But then this happened. I've heard this called the triangle of death. It resembles what we previously called callback hell. And it really can become a problem in large components. But luckily, in October of 2018, the React team gave us a breath of fresh air. They gave us hooks. So let's go back and revisit our count state injection using a custom hook. So this is how we left our with count component. Now let's turn it into a custom hook. First, we have to change to use a function, because you have to with hooks. And to be accepted as a hook, the function must start with the word use. Okay? Now let's convert our state to use React useState. And this is giving us back a tuple with our state and a mutator function. And so we can change our this.setState calls to use our mutator function. Here we're using the same callback syntax, where rather than provide the new state, you can provide a function that will take the old state and return the new state. And to be a proper hook citizen, we really should wrap these in React use callback. This is going to make sure that those functions are not recreated on every single call of this hook. They're going to have the same instance. And then, rather than render anything, we're just going to return our count, increment, and decrement values. Now, note here that we are passing back the values in an object as named keys. But another common practice with hooks is to return what's called a tuple, like this. And really, it depends on your use case, which is better API for your consumer. There are times to use one and times to use the other. You have to consider it on a case-by-case basis. So, and now, as is our pattern, let's look at how we consume hooks. Here's our component that was using with count render prop injection. The conversion to use our custom hook will look something like this. First of all, we pull our count, increment, and decrement out before the return, on top of that red line, remember, and we call a custom hook. And then we can get rid of our with count component. But to use hooks, we cannot use the class component structure. We must use a function component. So let's change to use that. And of course, with a function component, the function is your render function. And we're done. Pretty elegant, huh? And it's pretty easy to see that this won't suffer from the triangle of death like the render props do, because as we add on more injected state, we're just adding more hooks calls into our preparation stage of our function. So there we go, we're done. Hooks have killed render props, right? And for sure, let's go ahead and do the same thing that we did before and convert a hook API into a render props API. Watch this. This is so dead simple. Let's see, how hard could it be? Well, we're going to start with our function component, which is required when using hooks. And we call our hook to get our injected state. And we return whatever our children prop returns with that given state. It's literally 2 lines of code. I mean, and if you wanted to be crazy stupid about it, you could even write it like this, but please don't write components like that. Don't. So let's recap the history of React state injection. First, we had Mixins, and they were the primary way of doing things for a long time. But then Mixins sort of died of natural causes. But then higher order components swooped in, and they ruled the kingdom for several years. But then render props came in and brutally murdered HOCs, took the throne. And they ruled very happily for many years. And finally, hooks stormed the castle and took the crown and hung its flag from the ramparts. But wait, the title of this talk is Render Props Are Not Dead Yet. So why not? Sure seems like, why would we ever need to use a render prop again? So that's the misconception that I'm trying to correct in this talk. Let's go back and look at our complex component using Minihooks. Remember that red line through the return statement? All hooks go in the preparation side of the line, not in the JSX. As such, whenever any one of the values that our hooks are injecting changes, this entire component will be forced to re-render. And it would be great if re-rendering components was not a problem, but not all components are created equal, not are as super efficient at re-rendering. React's virtual DOM reconciler is very, very clever, and the memoization can help a lot, but sometimes you're forced to use components that are just inefficient, or for whatever reason, you can't fix them. And so, like, let's say your manager tells you that you have to include some third-party monstrosity inside of your efficient little counter component, okay? So here we are. You're using your useCount hook to maintain your count state, and we have to include this horrible monstrosity also in our component. Now, because every time you click on increment or decrement, we have to change the count state, which is going to re-render this entire component. Those other heavy components are going to have their render function called. And if they're slow, we're going to see performance issues as you rapidly click increment. So what can we do? Well, one immediately obvious solution would be to take this middle section out and put it into its own component. Take the use count hook out and put it there with its own component, and make a little custom component. So this component would look like your slow to render, and then your count component, and then there's slow to render. And making a custom component is really the only solution that you can do with hooks if you have this problem. You're really sort of forced into that. Well, it's not the only solution. But if you have to make a custom component every time you need to inject some states, it can get tedious, and you're going to end up with all these custom components everywhere. In my experience, I found that using a component with a render prep API is much, much, much more flexible when I need to inject a little bit of state into my JSX and not re-render the entire containing component. So notice that this section in the middle is the only part of this JSX that's going to re-render when we hit increment and decrement. The slow monstrosities on either side will not have their render functions called. And this can be extremely, extremely powerful. So to quote Mr. Jackson again, the main use of render props is delegating control of rendering in line without having to create a separate component, which hooks require you to do. So my message that I want to leave you with is that building your component, when you're out there building your component libraries or state management solutions, please don't think that render props are old and antiquated like Mixins or HOCs. There are still times when render props can be very, very useful. Thank you very much. React Europe.
I think you did a very good job explaining it. I attended your workshop yesterday, and I was amazed by not only how well put together it was, but just the whole format of the whole thing. So I just wanted to thank you for that. So one of the things that we talked about and that you kind of hit on in the talk was the fact that React hooks can't be used for everything, and that render props still have a place in React. And I was wondering if you could expand on that, maybe even a little bit more detail.
Well, it's just that for those cases where you need states in your JSX before, after you've already started, after you've already said return, and then here's my JSX that I'm returning. If you need state in there where you don't want the whole component to re-render, there is no other solution other than render props. And I distinctly remember when, on the day that they announced render props, I had a Twitter chat with Sophie. I said, hey, there's one thing that you can't do with this, and she said, yeah, actually that's a thing that isn't possible. But hooks are great for many, many things, but there's just that one little sliver of a use case that they can't help with.
Hi, everyone.
And if anyone remembers earlier, I was talking about the fact how both Gatsby and Next.js are really cool frameworks just to check out, because they teach you so much more about React and these skills that we already have. But, your talk also kind of reinforced a lot of those skills, and your workshop. We are getting some comments in the chat right now that very straight to the point, they said, for Eric. And again, that's an attest to how cleanly you put that together. So thanks again. I do have a question from... Yeah, absolutely. From the Discord, from Gisele, I want to say. So is the bottom line that it's just different tools for different use cases, and there's room for all three, or do higher order components, or are higher order components actually dead?
That was the thesis of my talk. Yes, I do think, again, in the same way that hooks will replace render props for just about everything. There is that one little sliver that I mentioned that if for some reason you need your injected states within your component lifecycle methods, and again, that's a thing that we're moving away from with hooks, is most of us are no longer writing new class components. We're starting with the function components.
Yes.
So again, that's not really a good case going forward into the future to need a HOC. But again, like I showed, both you can build, if you have a hook API, you can build a render prop API, and if you have a render prop API, you can build a HOC API. So as a
Yes.
I guess my main point is for library authors or people that are providing components to inject states that are going to be used by other developers. It's great to have a hooks API, but you also really should also include a render prep API.
Yes. And speaking of libraries, yours Final Form kind of uses this concept in practice, correct?
Exactly. Yes. All the logic are in hooks, and then there's just a little thin wrapper like I showed, where you get the state out of the hook and call props.children to render it. And it's a very elegant way to do things, because it gives other people the option to make their own component with your hook. But if you don't want to make your component, you just want the state injected, then you just throw a render prop into your
Yesterday during your workshop, you asked a question to all of the attendees at the beginning. Can you restate that question kind of in summary, and I'm wondering if people might actually chime in on the chat and try to answer that before you kind of go into an explanation a little bit, because I wanted to hear more about
What was
that.
my question?
Okay. See, this is why I asked you, because I was having a hard time remembering in my head. So it was, you gave a thumbs up or thumbs down on whether or not we should be, I think,
yes, I remember.
Okay.
If you're building your own form using saving the values using React useState, and you want to add some validation, so you want to display a required error when one of the fields is empty. The question was, do you put that required error into the component state or not?
Yes.
So,
and a lot of people answered yes, and that was or a thumbs up. And I was wondering if you could expand on it just a little bit.
Yeah. So some of the people misunderstood. I didn't communicate the question properly, and thought that I might mean states after you hit submit. And for that, we are going to need to save it into state. But in general, and this is true even outside of React, if you have data that can be computed relatively cheaply, you should not store that in state. Like, that's why errors, well, no, that's not true. That's if it's like for a required, if the value is there, then it's valid, and if not, then it isn't. Or if this number is bigger than the other, you should do that in that preparation section of your render function, because there's no need to save that into state.
All right.
And also, anytime you change state, you're gonna necessarily have to re-render your component, which unless you're gonna do that calculation at the same time that you're updating your value state, it's going to get into a mess.
Is there, I had a question here that, what about using something like useRef where it doesn't trigger a re-render? Would that come into play at all in this situation?
In the situation of validation errors?
What? Not necessarily. Yeah, I wasn't too sure about my question anyways. I was just trying to fill in, since we didn't have another question in here, but I was just thinking about how if you do use a useRef instead of using it for like a DOM or something, that it's not necessarily stored in a way that's going to cause your component to re-render. Is that true?
Right, but you want it to re-render if there is a new error. Is
Yes.
the problem?
Okay.
You could save it as yeah. Okay, so if for some reason your validation function was slow, and again, I'm generally assuming that we're doing simple stuff. But if your
Yep.
validation function was slow, then you could potentially like check if the new value is different from the old value that you saved in a ref, and only if it's different, then would you run the validation again,
Got it.
or something like that. But then again, you can trigger stuff using use effect as well. So
Okay.
that's not we don't want to get into.
All right. So I think that we're going to move on to the next talk. And is that correct, Patrick?
Yep.
And I guess we'll throw it over to John to introduce that.
Great. See you guys later.
Yeah, thanks for this talk, Eric. It was really good. So yeah, guys, we will be listening to a recording as for Josh talks about. Well, it's quite interesting actually. Says rejecting bongo kittens, achieving 3D balloons, and other lessons learned. So yeah, let's get right to it.